right, before we go on any further, there you can see these are the live visuals that we're getting from Milwaukee on your screens right now. You can see Donald Trump after surviving a horrific assassination attempt. You can see the bandage on his ear as well. That's where the bullet grazed past Donald Trump.
To elect Donald J. Trump as the next president of the United States.
This is Trump's third consecutive run since 2016. He has officially been named by the Republican National Convention. He's been nominated.
Of course, shaking hands with the Republican House Speaker Mike Johnson, his son standing behind him. Of course, surrounded by all Republican. And there he is, standing next to his running mate, J.D. Vance. Former President Donald Trump has arrived at the Republican National Convention after he and his running mate J.D. Vance were earlier formally nominated as the Grand Old Party ticket for the 2024 presidential election. This comes just 2 days after Trump survived an assassination attempt. Being greeted by a huge ovation there. This is his third consecutive run for the presidential post.
All right, for more on this, we're now being joined by Professor James A. Russell, who is an associate professor at the Department of National Security Affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School. He's joining us from Monterey, California. So thank you so much for joining us. Now, my first question to you is, opinion polls still suggest a close race between Trump and Biden after all that has transpired in the past few days. How close do you feel the race will be?
Well, one of the something that I'm sure your viewers must understand is that the American system for electing presidents is not based on the popular vote, but is based instead on the votes within individual states. So the answer to your question about the closeness of the race, what it comes down to essentially is how these candidates do, and I'm going to say 5 or 6 swing states. And those states are Pennsylvania, they're Nevada, they're Arizona, for example. Virginia is always also a close state. Florida used to be a swing state. Colorado is another one. Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan. All of these states, for example, are going to determine who gets the electoral college, that is to say, the system that we have in the United States to elect our presidents. A system, I should hasten to add, that was really designed in the 19th century when America was trying to keep the Union together, and gave more power to the former states of the Confederacy. So this is the answer to the question, which is that it comes down to how the election goes in these 5, 6, 7 states.
In these swing states. I get your point. Yes, Professor Russell, now Trump has announced his running mate. Of course, that's J.D. Vance. He's standing right there next to Mr. Trump at the RNC. Now, he was a self-styled never-Trumper, that these are his words, and had once compared Trump to Hitler as well. How do you assess their partnership in the current race?
Well, this is a pretty common phenomenon, I would say, which is that 5, 6 years ago, you had Elise Stefanik, who is a very high-ranking person in the House of Representatives on the Republican side. There's some similarities here in which the Republicans at that time denounced Trump, said he was an ideologue and an extremist, and then they realized that they had to kind of toe the line, and in part in order to replenish their own campaign coffers. And what Elise Stefanik, of course, discovered is that as soon as she started in with the pro-Trump rhetoric, her campaign coffers went sky high. And of course, money in American politics is regrettably this instrumental feature of those politics, and has in some ways outweighed the importance of parties per se, which is to say that when candidates can become financially independent, that enables them to have more power. And I think Vance is also another classic sort of example of this. Vance comes from out of nowhere. He's running in a crowded Senate sort of race. He openly embraces Trump, and Trump helps him through the crowded Republican field in Ohio to win. And Vance is a Trump sycophant, like many of the Republicans. The interesting observation I would make today is that the Republican Party today is not really much of a political party anymore. It's a cult of personality. I'm at a loss, for example, to explain to your viewers what exactly the Republican Party stands for anymore, except maybe cutting taxes on the very rich people. In other words, it ceased to have this sort of any degree of coherence, and has instead become defined by these culturally dissonant issues like visceral rhetoric directed against immigrants, so on and so forth, people who are not white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And of course, we see the same phenomenon in varying degrees across the Western democracies, which is to say the rise of this right-wing populist figures that are espousing mostly extremely negative sort of points of view. And so another example in the Republican Party's case is that they want to undermine government institutions. It's one of the contradictions of the whole Trump-Vance sort of candidacy, if you will, is that they're seeking to run the very institutions which they want to tear down.
Professor
it's
Russell,
a very
you spoke about their partnership. Now, I just wanted to also give a little insight into how, or rather, I would ask you to give a little insight into how Trump lost back in 2020, and then I want to share this with you now. His brash, often aggressive behavior and willingness to forego traditional American allies. Now, all this went against him back in 2020. Do you feel that's going in his favor in any capacity this time?
Yeah, it's a good question, and in many ways it's the most important question, which is to say, how does one explain the dynamism of politics, which is to say the shifts in politics. In the last election, Joe Biden won by 9 million in the popular vote and easily won in the Electoral College. And yet here we sit 4 years later, in which my opinion, for whatever it's worth, is that Biden has actually been a pretty good president. He led the country out of the COVID pandemic. The economy is back growing. We're at full employment. He's tried to reinvigorate America's alliances. In other words, all of these things that were quote unquote wrong with the country when Trump was president the last time around. And yet here we sit 4 years later, and Biden doesn't seem able to make this case that the country is actually in better shape today than it was 4 years ago.
Right, Professor Russell, sorry to interject there, but just to expand on what Shivan had asked as well, and this is going to be a two-parter, so just stay with me here. I wanted to understand, and I guess elections are largely influenced by voter perceptions and voter sentiments as well. After surviving that assassination bid, we've seen a lot of people come out in support of the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. And at the same time, we have Biden, who's facing questions over his mental acuity, his mental sharpness. How do you think this will impact the elections and voter patterns this time around?
I think there isn't a question. And first, we all have to say at the outset what a horrific event it was. There isn't any other way to describe it. But there is also as you know, you are a television station in the world's largest democracy, and you know the important and the visceral importance of images. And Trump's raised fist with the blood coming out of his ear it has become the defining iconic image of the campaign, of course, and it feeds the Trump, kind of narrative. It's a false narrative, in my opinion, but it's a narrative nonetheless which suggests that he has been victimized and he's being persecuted and he's the underdog, as contrasted to Biden, of course, who, let's be honest about it, Biden should have stepped down 6 months ago, 9 months ago. He's too old to be president. And I don't think there's any other way to sort of state it so clearly. He's too old to be president. I mean, if we look just, for example, all of his frailties and faults have been on display in the war in Gaza, in which he has just appeared to be sort of clueless and not know what to do, and has portrayed weakness.
Yes.
For example, that's just one example. But the contrast between these images of an aging sort of frail octogenarian versus Trump raising his fist with the blood coming from his ear, it reinforces the narrative and the imagery that it's a false narrative and it's a false imagery. I mean, Trump, for example, likes to talk about the system, quote unquote, being rigged against him, that he's being persecuted by this system, which is arrayed against him, when exactly the opposite is true. The Republicans have stuffed the Supreme Court of the United States and the lower courts with right-wing ideologues.
Professor Russell.
They were just...
Yeah, I just want to interject there. Now, you know those contrasting images that you just spoke about, I just want to bring the focus back there with Trump on one end surviving an assassination bid with his fist in the air, looking rather aggressive, saying he wants to fight. And then, of course, Biden still trying to convince people that he is ready and he's not old enough to not run for the presidential bid yet again. Do you feel the fact that Biden is struggling to convince people is also going in Trump's favor, and all that aggressiveness which went against Trump the last time around is kind of going in his favor this time because Biden is struggling to convince people about his age?
And there can be no question about this. But
then it all comes down to optics, doesn't it? You know, instead of the real issues.
No. Politics, I don't want to say it's all about optics, but it plays an incredibly important role in today's digitized world in which I grew up, for example, in a world where we had people got their news and their images from one news show, the Huntley Brinkley show, for example. That's not true anymore. Today we're in a world today of TikTok, and in other words, the imagery is proceeding, rattling around in the digital space at the speed of light, and from all kinds of different sources, of course. And this imagery that you have cited here, it's a powerful one in the campaign today, and one which is, of course, goes against President Biden, who let's be honest, also the Democratic political leadership has not all, but they have hinted strongly that he needs to step aside for a younger sort of candidate. And they're correct in this, of course. Yeah.
All right. Well, Professor Russell, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA with your insights on this. It was great having you on the show with us. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.